So, what hope is there in suffering? Now, you might already know this. With suffering, it's either you've been there, or you are there, or you will be there one day. So this actually isn't a light, impersonal question. It usually comes with scars or with tears. What does Christianity offer in the problem of suffering? Now, before we kind of get to that, it's worth me asking you guys, how do you explain the problem of suffering? So think for a moment, how does suffering fit into your worldview, your reality? How does it fit in? Generally speaking, there are two natural responses to suffering. There's fluke, chance, and there's fatalism. Let me go through those very quickly. So firstly, fluke, chance. Fluke is kind of your more Western atheist response to suffering with no God. See, for anyone here, why is there suffering? Fluke. Pure coincidence. It just is. There's no rhyme, there's no reason. Suffering just is, and it sucks. But if that's you, I hope you're able to see that someone in this category doesn't actually have a problem with suffering. They don't have a problem with it. It just is. And yet, think about it, everything in you is outraged that there is this thing called suffering, that there are all these bad things that happen. But because of your worldview, you can't actually legitimately ask why. The why questions of suffering. It just is. And so suck it up and move on. Now, on the other hand, remember fluke, chance. On the other side is fatalism. This is kind of your more traditional view. This is a resigned position towards suffering. Suffering here also just is, but it's for two different reasons, a couple of different reasons. Let me give you at least two. Number one, it could be that God has decreed this. And so who are we to question? Number two, it could be that we're simply getting what we deserve. In other words, divine karma. And again, if this is the case, who are we to argue? Now, I hope you're able to see that just as with this view, so with this one, there isn't actually a real problem with suffering. Although everything in you might be screaming out against the presence of suffering, you can't ask the why question fully, because maybe you are responsible for why you are suffering the way that you are, or maybe it's simply God's will. And so you've got to grin and bear it and move on. Now, the good news, and this is why I love talking about this, the good news is that followers of Jesus are not in either one of these camps. We're not fluke or chance because we know that God controls all things. And we are not pure fatalism because we don't live under some aloof God. In other words, some God is kind of so distant to us that he's just always there. He's never here. Instead, Jesus' followers trust in a crucified Savior who enters into our mess and confirms for us both the rightness of having a problem with suffering, and it also gives us a certain hope in suffering. See, this is the Christian response. This is the Christian hope in suffering. And even think about it like this. If you had to open up the Bible, you would see that the Bible starts with the perfect Garden of Eden. And it ends with the perfect city in the new creation with no pain or suffering. But one of the things is that in between those 2 points, how it starts and how it ends, there is a history that is full of 66 books of struggle and suffering and pain and death. In other words, the Bible gets us. It understands us. It knows our struggles. It doesn't kind of just gloss over them and say, these things don't exist. No, it knows the presence of suffering and death, etc. And you even have a part of the book like the Psalms, which is a type of poetry. And it even gives us the words to be able to cry out to God in the midst of our suffering. Not just to kind of grin and bear it and move on. But the good thing is that the scriptures also remind us that God is moving in our world. He's moving our world actually to a point when suffering one day will be banished. And I can be sure that that is the case and not just some kind of pipe dream, because God has entered into our suffering in real time and space to fix things and to one day restore things. And so Jesus actually is the anchor point when it comes to hope in suffering. He is how I know that there can be hope in suffering. Now, I'll be plain with you guys, okay? I don't know how anyone gets through suffering without Jesus. So you've got no God. How do you do it? Or you do have a God, but he isn't the compassionate Father of Jesus. I don't know how you do it. But in suffering, me and millions of others know a real God of scars. A God who wept at loss. A God who got angry at a gravesite. A God who bled. And a God who promises to be with me through suffering. How do you get through things? With the Christian worldview, we're given the ability to be able to ask the why questions of suffering. But we can do it because we know and follow a Jesus who suffered like us and for us, so in our place, but actually even through his suffering, through his life and his death and his resurrection, he gives us a certain hope even while we are in the middle of suffering.